Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast with me, Newcastle United editor Allan Stokes, and I'm joined this week once again by John Gibson for another episode of Let's Talk About. Now, usually on these Let's Talk About episodes, we divulge about one player and we go into lots of depth about them. This week, we're going to do something slightly different and we're going to talk about a range of fringe players on the cusp of that Newcastle United first team and whether they've got a future on Tyneside or not. Now, John, we're recording this on Wednesday morning. By the time this goes out, either tonight or on Thursday, the situation could look very different. But at the moment, it looks like Allan Saint-Maximin is on his way out, and there's no better place to start than talking about the Frenchman now. It's something that I've spoke about on the podcast before, and it's something that I find really interesting. But when Amanda Staveley sat down for her first interview as co-owner of Newcastle, the Chronicle went and spoke to her and interviewed her, and one of the first questions they asked her was, are you going to build a team around Allan Saint-Maximin? And we're not even 2 years down the line, and already, it looks like he's leaving. How interesting is it to see that he was once the main man at Newcastle United, and now, seemingly, I know he splits opinion, but it looks like, there's a majority of fans that might actually say, okay, now's the time to sell him.
Yeah, it's quite startling, isn't it? And in a lots of ways, it epitomizes how Newcastle have changed so quickly from the Steve Bruce, Mike Ashley era to the Saudi owners, Amanda, the Rubens, and Eddie Howe. We have moved on a pace, and this whole this whole podcast really is about the people that have been overtaken by events, if you like, but still maybe have a future at Newcastle. I mean, with Maxi, it's quite incredible because under Brucey, he wasn't just plan A, he was plan A, B, C, and D. He was the only plan in town, was give the ball to Maxi, whether he was on the edge of our penalty area or the halfway line, and then just let him loose and see what he might or might not be able to do. He's gone from that to being a bench player effectively at the end of last season, the impact sub, if you like, and now probably going out the club. Now, it's changed things enormously, and we saw the writing on the wall towards the end of last season when, I mean, I love Eddie Howe because he's great about everybody. He says the most wonderful things about the player just before he disappears. He did it with Shelby, he did it with Wood, he's done it with Maxi, he's done it with everybody because he's nice to people, and that's good. That is the good man management. But the writing's been on the wall for Maxi because remember when Dan Ashworth, Aaron, was first appointed, one of the first things he said, and it was a little bit of an eye opener because, is this, are you opening a window on reality? He said, the way you are these days with financial fair play, you've got to trade. Sometimes you've got to sell a big player to get potentially a bigger player through the door because you've got to have money coming in as well as money going out. And when you look at Newcastle, that being the case, right now, who would make good money for Newcastle? Obviously, Maxi, who would make around 30 million with all the bits and bobs added to the deal. It would be about 30 million. Darlow is only going to make about 5 million when he goes to one of his many suitors. Ryan Fraser, uh, about the same. Hayden, Hendrick, peanuts. Manquillo, peanuts. We got rid of Wood and Shelby because Nottingham Forest were out there, and it's a wonder they're not in for Maxi, isn't it? They're in for everybody. But no, it's Maxi's the only one that can give us a decent return in terms of cash. And the simple question we're all faced with now is Harvey Barnes, because we know that's who we're really talking about here, as the guy coming in. I mean, he's desperate to come here. Howe wants him here, but the financial setup, the fee is the problem. Now, this unlocks the door for Bonds to come in. Now, is that a good deal for Newcastle? Maxi out and Bonds in. In Eddie Howe's mind, it is. he says quite rightly he's got a right to say what he thinks. He doesn't want Maxi to go, but he didn't want Chris Wood to go and he went, and he didn't want Shelby to go and he went. You've got to get rid to bring in. And I honestly think that Harvey Barnes is an upgrade on Maxi. Why? Mainly because he's more consistent.
Mhm.
He's less injury prone. He doesn't pick up a lot of injuries. He plays an awful lot of games. He works hard going backwards as well as forwards, which Maxi doesn't. Maxi goes one way. Or
Mhm.
he goes sideways as well as forward, but he doesn't go backwards, that's for certain. And Harvey Barnes does. And I think he's more consistent. I mean, the thing with Maxi is on a good day, he's sensational. Manchester City last season up here,
Mhm.
sensational. The game afterwards, the goal he got to rescue us at Wolves, terrific, wonderful volley. But he then has frustrating days, and a lot of them. And Harvey Barnes doesn't. He's more consistent. So it's always a matter of opinion. Players like Maxi will always divide opinion. We've had that before. Hatton Ben Arthur divided opinion, Lauren Robert divided opinion, because ball players do. Because on a good day they look sensational, on a bad day they're frustrating as heck.
Yeah.
And I think Harvey Barnes is more the um, Eddie Howe type of player, as I think Anthony Gordon is, than Maxi is. Maxi on a great day is wonderful, but he only has them every so often, and he has a
Mhm.
lot of very frustrating days at the same time. And that's not being nasty to the guy because he's going out, because he has given me some wonderful moments to treasure when he's been at his scintillating absolute best.
Yeah.
But he's not always at that.
Well, he isn't, is he? And that I made a point about this on Twitter last night when people were sort of quite disappointed by Harvey Barnes coming in to replace Maxi, and I can't really get my head around that. I think one of the reasons maybe is that I was speaking to one of the fans on the podcast we did on Monday, and they were saying that if we're going to get rid of Maxi, it needs to be a real upgrade. It needs to be someone like Chiesa from Juventus. It needs to be someone like Kavica from Napoli. It needs to be one of these big statement signings. But actually, when you actually boil down at the stats of Harvey Barnes, he scores more goals. The assists are about the same. As you've mentioned, he plays a lot more minutes. I think he's played 2,600 more minutes than Maxi in the Premier League, and he only made his debut about 4 or 5 months before.
Yeah,
There's a lot of positives there for Harvey Barnes, and I think you look at what Eddie Howe's done with some of these Newcastle players, especially the young English players, Joe Willock especially, now on the cusp of an England call-up, and I think you could see the same with Harvey Barnes. But just going back to Maxi, Eddie Howe has been ultra consistent. He's been, from day one. He said it on the last day of the season at Chelsea. He said it at the weekend. He said, I want Allan Saint-Maximin to stay. I love Maxi. And yes, there's talking about FFP and Newcastle needing to sell, but you get the feeling that if Maxi wanted to stay, he would. Why, for you, John, is it that it looks like he's going to go? Because he's still got the backing of most of the fans. Is it just because of the money that gets thrown around the Saudi league? Is it because he wants a new challenge? I mean, it's a big step to leave a club where you've been, a fan favourite for years. They're just about to be in the Champions League, and you're deciding to move, out of Europe. It's a big call, isn't it?
oh, it's a huge call because this was his chance to play in the Champions League.
Yeah.
And you can't get better than that. Wherever you go, and I'm not talking about Saudi because they're not in the Champions League, but wherever you went in this country or Europe, you can't get better than playing in the Champions League. And his side is just about to do that. So it's a huge call. But there's several factors will come into this, apart from the fact that he'll make an absolute fortune in Saudi. I mean, he'll become rich for the rest of his life. Now, if you
Mhm.
want to take away the glory, i.e., of playing in a side that might win a big trophy or the Champions League or the Premier League or a trophy at Wembley, if it was Newcastle in the future, if you take that out, and if you're working for a living and the living is to make the best for your family for the rest of the time, then Saudi's going to tick a lot of boxes because you're going to make a fortune. And he's going to be with other players that have done the same thing. Probably Mahrez from Man City.
Manchester City.
The same thing. I think There's several things. First of all, there's the reality if you're him that you're not going to be exactly a bit player, but you're not going to be first choice. I mean, if he looks at the end of last season, he wasn't starting game after game after game after game at Newcastle. So you've got to realise that if you're him, that that's not going to happen. And regardless of what Eddie might say publicly about how he loves him and he does him, and he does, and on a good day, we all love Maxi. Good, what is there not to love? But the work rate is not there. And Dan Ashworth warned us when he first come in, you've got to trade. The only way around this financial fair play is trade. You've got to get some decent money coming in to be able to spend. This releases Harvey Barnes. Now, if we somehow had managed to stagger the fee for Barnes so that we still got him in and we kept Maxi, the next question to you is, which one starts regularly in the team? And the answer would be Harvey Barnes. It wouldn't be Maxi. It would be Harvey Barnes that would start. And therefore, you've got to sacrifice somebody more than decent to be able to get an upgrade. And Newcastle see this as an upgrade. Let's cut out all these sort of in-between flowery stuff. If Newcastle United didn't see Harvey Barnes as an upgrade on Allan Saint-Maximin, then they wouldn't sign Harvey Barnes and they would stick with Saint-Maximin.
Exactly.
They see him as an upgrade. Now, they haven't done a lot wrong in the transfer market, Owen. I'm not having to go Maxi. What I'm saying is they haven't done a lot wrong. And if they see this guy is an upgrade, he's an upgrade. And if we have to sacrifice somebody along the way, then you do. There will always be split opinion with what I call it old-fashioned ball players. Hatem Ben Arthur. Lots of fans loved Hatem Ben Arthur. But you look at his end product and you think, was it good enough? A lot of fans loved Laurent Robert, but you look at his end product and say, was it good enough? In the same with this guy, if you've got skills, you're adored. If you've got panache and flair, you're adored. But are you a best team player? Not necessarily so. And for us to step forward, they're putting only time will prove whether it's a good meeting. I think that people don't realise how good Harvey Barnes is because when you thought of Leicester, you thought of Maddison. And you thought of Vardy. You thought of Maddison, all the tricks, pinging the ball, and you thought of Vardy 2 years ago, not now because of his age, on his bike, blistering off the last defender and tucking it away. And that was Leicester. And so you forgot about how good Barnes was.
And when teams get relegated, it's so easy to just write off players that have actually stood out in those teams, isn't it? I mean, Barnes last year in a very poor Leicester team got 13 goals.
Yes.
Not to be forgotten about.
Yeah, and as you say, in a Leicester side that was getting spanked. He got 13 goals. He has won an England cap. I think he could blossom into being quite a player. And yes, we'll always have fond memories of Maxi if he goes, and we're writing him off before he's gone. But I think there's a very, very, very good chance that he is going. That's why he wasn't at Rangers and why he's not flown to America. I think he will go, and he's nobody's fool. I think he's realised that he's no longer the main act in town. Which is what he was, and I think he loves being that. And he'll go out and do wonderfully well for them and win some more fans over. But my old mate Supermac was always the man with Maxi because he had a bee in his bonnet about Maxi because he didn't, and he was an England centre forward, so he knew what he was looking at about wingers because wingers made goals for him, and he thought like a centre forward. And he always said, put his goals and put his assists on the table, and neither are good enough. And he was quite persistent about that. And you've got to follow his point. He is an entertainer. I mean, when he played against Man City and he terrorised Kyle Walker, if I saw that player every week, I wouldn't dream of wanting him to go. But I tell you what, neither would Eddie Howe. If that was a player you saw every week, but it's not the player, unfortunately, you see every week. And he can be a moody player. Let's be truthful. Maxi can be a moody player. you almost sometimes see him when he turns out. Sometimes, bless him, he looks like the Invisible Man, doesn't he? He's got that many bandages on his legs and his wrists and his head. He looks as if. But sometimes when the mood goes, you think, by Jove, this today will be entertaining. But there's other days when you get the uneasy feeling the mood's not quite there. I will have lovely memories of Maxi if he does go, but I think you can upgrade every single player in the world bar the one that's obviously the best.
Yeah.
You can, if you've got Harry Kane, would you say Haaland, it would be an upgrade? Well, if he only took goals last season, Kane probably got 30. Sensational. This other bloke got 52. There's always somebody slightly better than yourself.
And I think with Maxi, it's really interesting because as Supermax says, and as you say, as we all say, goals and assists are not good enough. And I think if you just showed somebody the stats and the goals and you didn't tell them who it was, they would say, oh yeah, you can definitely upgrade it. But because it's Maxi, he's got this really weird sort of air of being like, amazing. And look, he is. Everybody goes on about the Manchester City game. He had Kyle Walker on toast. Everybody knows it. Everybody talks about that amazing goal he scored at Wolves almost a year ago, but that was his last goal for Newcastle almost a year ago. He
Yes.
doesn't have the consistency, and I think I completely agree with you about I will have some fantastic memories, and everybody keeps making the point that under Bruce, when it was going bad, Maxi was the man that dragged us out of the relegation scraps, and we'll always be grateful for that. But I just think, let's not kid ourselves that he's irreplaceable. He's completely replaceable. I think Newcastle, for me personally, I think Barnes is an upgrade. I'm really excited to see that deal. But yeah, it's just such an interesting one about this sort of aura that he's got around him.
Well, Max is this lovable character. When you see him, and you see his face smiling, and you see him running, and the beads are flying in the air, and you warm to him. He's got that thing about him. When you see him giving away Rolex watches to punters, and when you see him at the food bank, he has got that. There's things that endear you to him. He's that sort of guy, and he always will be. And God bless him for coming amongst us, because he brightened our day. And as we say, in Steve Bush's day, he was the one thing that was worth admittance money, because the rest of the team didn't entertain at all. It was worth putting your money down in the hope that you saw Maxi do something. But I mean, everything gets taken better. I remember when Isaac Hayden was the best midfield player we had, and people were chanting his name and saying, will you stay, because he was going to leave for family reasons, and we've got to have him stay, because in the crowd were chanting his name and everything. He's still with us, but we've forgotten about him, haven't we? Yeah. He's still with us, but he's been so overtaken in midfield by Bruno and Joe Linton and Joe Willock, and I mean, he's seen as yesterday's man, and he is. And I'm not comparing Maxi with Hayden, because skill for skill, Maxi's up there right at the top. But I do think sometimes you've got to sacrifice a little bit of outlandish flair for consistency.
Yeah.
And I think what Barnes will bring is consistency. Maxi, even those that absolutely adored him, can never make a case out from being consistent, because his form, like a lot of ball-playing wingers, his form went up and down.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll move on, because I feel like we could sit here and spend an hour talking about Maxi, because he's that much of a talking point, and he splits it that much. We'll move to the defence then, John, and a player who, again, under Bruce was an absolutely huge part of those relegation fights, and he's been a fantastic servant, and that is Jamaal Lascelles. Now, he still has the captaincy, and Kieran Trippier, bless him, still makes sure that every time he comes on the pitch, he gets the armband. Lascelles is another player that Eddie Howe has essentially said, look, if he wants to stay, there's a place for him here in the dressing room. He's clearly a very, very good leader. He's a good presence behind the scenes, and I think Howe really appreciates that. He only played a handful of games last season. He didn't do himself, a disservice in those. He had some tough games against Manchester City and Liverpool. What do you make of his future, and what's your which way are you leaning in terms of keeping him or getting rid of him this summer?
To me, he's our Harry Maguire. He mirrors everything that's happening with Maguire at Manchester United. You look at Manchester United. Maguire is made captain before this manager. Maguire is made captain. He's the England centre half. He's this big guy, as Lascelles is. He's a big presence. He is the fixture there. And then all of a sudden, you get a new manager comes in. He's stripped of the captaincy. The same thing as Lascelles. He's
Mm-hmm.
captain, but not on the side. Now he's stripped of the captaincy. I mean, Lascelles may as well be stripped of the captaincy because, to all effects, in purpose, the captain is Kieran Trippier. It's nice to leave and allow him to have this dignity because he's earned the right, Lascelles, to have that sort of dignity because he's done a terrific, terrific job for Newcastle United. And he was a leader very early when we were chaotic and he was brought in the club. He was the young man then that became a leader when he wasn't the captain. And got annoyed at some of the things that were happening around him. I mean, he's been here an awful long time. And he has earned the right to have the respect that he has got from the other players and from the manager. But it is one of those situations, isn't it? It's exactly the same as Maxi. If he wants to stay, he can stay. The difference with Lascelles is he's not going to make you 30 million in the transfer market like Maxi, which is why Maxi went, by the way. If Maxi was only going to make 5 million like Fraser or Darlow, he probably would still be here. But he can release big money. Lascelles isn't going to release big money. But if Lascelles wanted to go for first team football, we would let him go. And if you're being cruel, we wouldn't miss him. But he's good backup. He'll do the job as backup. But I mean, the change is quite phenomenal, isn't it? I mean, the old Newcastle and the new Newcastle. The old Newcastle, Lascelles was untouchable as skipper, and Maxi was untouchable as the number one performer. Now, neither are in the team. And that's how much we've improved very, very quickly. I mean, he was a terrific voice. Benitez made him skipper, and quite rightly made him skipper. And he led by example. He's played, 225 games for us, but only 7 in the Premier League last season, which is his worst return in his 8 seasons here. So he is getting overtaken, as in time everybody does. Ronaldo's second time in Manchester United got overtaken. First time, he was a world superstar. It happens. It happens. But I think he's got a lot to give this club. He'll never be a disruptive voice within the club, which is what has been suggested with Ryan Fraser. That will never happen with Lascelles. And if he's happy to be a senior pro in the club with a voice in the dressing room and be a cover, then Eddie Howe will be very grateful for that. If he thinks it's like Maguire, if he thinks he should go and because he's still a first team Premier League player and play elsewhere, then he would go with Newcastle's blessing. I'm pretty certain of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on it there about Benitez being him captain. And I think, when people speak to me about Lascelles, I think it's so easy to forget that when Benitez came in and he was trying to steady the ship after McLaren's sort of disastrous half a season, Lascelles really stepped up. He was a young centre-back in that dressing room. And I remember the 3-1 defeat at St Mary's against Southampton, and Lascelles came out after and absolutely eviscerated his teammates and said, we're sleepwalking towards relegation. And that was the moment that he really sort of arrived on the scene as a potential leader. Is there a worry that sort of part of his career gets forgotten if he just sort of blends into the background and then eventually leaves in 12 months' time? Or do you think he'll always have that sort of respect for the Newcastle fans because of how he sort of acted back in the day?
Yes, I think Aaron, that he'll always get that respect. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think once a player's career at Newcastle United is ended, then fans step back and look at it. Maxi, there was a lot of feeling towards the end. Maxi was adored originally, then he always split opinion, but there was a lot of feeling last season, oh, he's not fitting in, get rid and all that. And then all of a sudden, when it looks as if you are getting rid, there's people will say, oh, but what a great, he's entertained us. This is not a good move. Maxi will be remembered with affection. And I believe that Lascelles, once he goes, and I'm not meaning now, it might be in a couple of years' time, or it might be when by the way, it'll be when he wants to go,
Yeah.
because I think he's earned that right, and Eddie's very good on that. And unlike Maxi, he's not going to bring us a fortune, so you can't, put him a parachute and kick him out the plane because you need the money. He's not going to produce that much money, but he will have. Yes, he can be forgotten as this season goes on, because if he stays, he probably only plays 6 games in the Premier League. He might well play in the FA Cup and the League Cup and whatever, but he'll not play a lot. But when he does go, and his facts and figures are down in the record books, and a long service and the dignity he brought to this club, he will well be remembered. Because in the dark days, when we had to stay afloat under Ashley for 14 years, we had 2 relegations, and apart from that 5th top finish, a fight against relegation every season. And in that stage, people like Lascelles and Matt Ritchie, who we'll probably get onto, and Maxi, were vitally important to us. There's part of the stepping stones of history with Newcastle, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be top dog for the rest of the time. And being a nice guy, and both are nice guys, doesn't mean you get picked for the
Yeah,
first
absolutely.
team automatically.
Absolutely, and I think, as you say, he played such a big part in that in the old Newcastle United. Hopefully, that when he does leave, whether it's this summer or next, he does sort of get that respect that he deserves, despite falling down the pecking order. Now, moving on to another player who's very very similar to Lascelles in many respects, and that's Martin Dubravka, a
Yeah,
player who had Newcastle fans. He was absolutely adored from his first debut against Manchester United. He won them so many points back in the day when they were scrapping at the bottom under Steve Bruce. Very, very quick to jump ship last summer when Nick Pope came in. He just sort of stood back and said, look, I don't want to be in a battle for the number 1 spot. I'm going to leave and I'm going to go to Manchester United. We all know how that worked out. And eventually, he sort of came back with his tail between his legs in January and said, look, maybe I was a bit hasty. The sort of mood from Dubravka and Howe seems to have changed in the last couple of months. Howe seems to want to keep him, but ultimately you've got, at the minute, 5 goalkeepers on the books. Caldwell were expecting to go to make that 4.
yes,
Does Dubravka have a future as a number 2, or is it time for him to go and maybe end his career as a number 1 elsewhere?
that's up to him. The sadness, perhaps, Aaron, is that while we can see Maxi being adored by fans, and while we can see Lascelles being adored by fans, and Dubravka has earned that right, but the way he left to Manchester United is tarnished a little bit
Yeah.
his image. There's fans that say, he was quickly out the door there. It's a shame that that's happened, because it has to. You can understand the player wanting first team, but that was on loan, and you got carried away because it was Manchester United, but the gear was there, who was very much in charge at that time. I mean, this lad did so well for us in 2018. He was the Northeast Player of the Year, not just the Newcastle Player of the Year. And when he was on that run of being the Newcastle first team regular, the one thing that always used to be said about Newcastle United when they looked at the team was probably the only position we didn't need a new player in was goalkeeper, because Dubravka was the Northeast Player of the Year. He was playing outstandingly well for us. But as I already said, when you talk about Maxi and Harvey Barnes and who else, there's always somebody better than you. And you know what? Nick Pope was an upgrade, is an upgrade on Dubravka. And that happens. That's life. That's football. Football is a harsh old world. You get paid a lot. You're a hero one day, but you mightn't be a hero the next day because somebody else comes along. And Nick Pope is, in my eyes, a step up on Martin Dubravka, who's 34 now, which is not old for a goalkeeper, because goalkeepers go on a lot longer than outfield players. But you know, it's the way he left for Manchester United is a shame, because it has sullied his position.
Yeah.
And how ironic is it? I mean, when Pope got sent off, Dubravka went in goal against Liverpool, and all of a sudden, he didn't play one Premier League game for Manchester United, but all of a sudden he can't play in a League Cup final for us because the only couple of games he played for Manchester United was in the League Cup.
Yeah.
How ironic for him was that, and how awful for us was that, because it meant we had to take a risk on Carriers, who did nothing wrong, and is still in the record books as his only competitive game for Newcastle United was in a cup final. I mean, he could be in the record books and in the Guinness Book of Records for all time if he doesn't get a game elsewhere. I mean, yeah, I mean, it was obvious with the Newcastle goalkeeping situation, the way it was at the end of last season, that either Carl Dollo or Martin Dubravka would have to be sold because you couldn't keep, and you wouldn't wish to keep them both when you've got Pope. Um, in a way, you can understand why it's Darlow who wants to go. He's a bit younger than Dubravka. He's got more of his career in front of him. He wants first team football. Dubravka's 34. He went to Manchester United only as a cover keeper, not first choice. He's a cover keeper at Newcastle, so he's not any worse off. If he got a transfer now, he'd only be a cover keeper if it was to a Premier League club, and he would have to drop down to the Championship or even beneath to get a number one job. So, and he is a nice lad. It's a shame that this Manchester United thing boomeranged on him. But, the way I see it is you really need four goalkeepers. And the four for Newcastle this season will be Nick Pope, Dubravka is number two, Karius is number three, and Gillespie is number four. Gillespie could easily have gone, but you need a four because if you get an injury to one of them, you've got to have three keepers the whole time. And Gillespie's got a year, but it's because he's willing to sit as number four keeper. He's not, I mean, it's obvious that he's not going to take part at first team level because we could have played him in the League Cup final.
Mm-hmm.
But we went out and found Carriers, didn't we, without a club and played him. So it's obvious that Gillespie is in that fourth slot and he's taken that for this season. But the three goalkeepers I would expect is to be Pope, Dubravka and Carriers.
So on that sort of basis, if Martin Dubravka for whatever reason leaves this summer and gets a good offer elsewhere, do you think Newcastle need to dip into the market and get another backup, or do you think Loris Karius is good enough to be a number two?
He could. We don't really know, do we? Because I think
it's so hard to tell, isn't it? Because he's looked very good in the two friendlies the last couple of days, and as you say, did nothing wrong in the League Cup. And I think the fact that Eddie Howe has kept him round shows he's clearly doing something behind the scenes. But we just aren't sure whether he's good enough to be sort of a stand-in for Pope yet, do we?
The sadness from his point of view is his career got firstly done by and sullied by with Liverpool in the Champions League final. I mean, that hangs over him like a damp cloak and will never be forgotten and has boomeranged on the rest of his career. There's absolutely no question about that. I think he's a very good number three. Well, I don't know if I'd want him as a number two. If I needed a number two, I would want either Dubravka or Darlow to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to, I mean, Eddie Howe's a shrewd cookie. You've got to think he's sat down and talked with, thinks exactly the same way as we think. Either Dubravka or Darlow can be my number two, Karius is three, and Gillespie's four. But he's got to have a reassurance that before he sells Darlow to Hull, Leeds, Middlesbrough, all the clubs, before he sells him, Dubravka is not going to get on his high horse and say, I want to leave after Darlow's left, because then we are in trouble. You've got to have some reassurance that Dubravka has said to Howe, I will stay and be a backup keeper, and therefore he will then sell Darlow.
I think if Dubravka has said that and he does stay as a number two, it will do something to fix that relationship that he sort of sullied with Newcastle fans. Because it's funny, I think if it had been a lot of other clubs that he jumped ship to last summer, it wouldn't have mattered as much. But the fact he went to Manchester United, where he knew he was going to be a number two anyway, it did, as you say, tarnish that reputation just a little bit. It'll be very, very interesting to see whether he stays or goes between now and the end of the summer. moving back to an attacking player that we're going to talk about, and that's Jacob Murphy. Now, if we'd have been sat here 12 months ago talking about Jacob Murphy, I think everybody would be very, very surprised that he was still a part of this club, especially in and around the first team.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it is. I think you go back to the cup final, and I think around that time of the season, I remember Murphy came off the bench in the cup final and he looked really direct and sharp and he was creating chances. He very nearly scored a very good goal towards the end. And that really sort of acted as a platform for him between then and the end of the season. He got back into Howe's plans. He, took Miguel Almiron's spot on that right-hand side. We expect that he will be still with Newcastle beyond the summer. I don't think we're looking to sell him. But what does Murphy's future hold? Do you see him having another season like he did last season, or do you think he's maybe salvaged that Newcastle career, but only for the short term?
Yes, I don't see him as a first-team regular, because that's going to be very tough in the wide places, because you've got Almiron, who's scored a lovely goal at Rangers, which was quite reminiscent to the way he was scoring the same type of finish as he was before Christmas. Of last season. He dried up in the second half of the season, but he took it like that. You've got Almiron for the two positions, the two wide positions. You've got Almiron, you've got Gordon, who a lot's expected of, having got the lift of scoring against Chelsea and the way he played in the under-21s for England when he was player of the tournament, and the way he played up at Rangers. He's got to be big time. Harvey Barnes will come if Maxi goes. So there's another winger. You've got Joe Linton that plays out there. You've got Anderson that plays out there, and you've got Murphy. So I mean, Murphy surprised me in the nicest of ways last season, because when he got in the team, he did well. There's absolutely no question about that. But I do not see him as a regular first teamer. I don't think he's going to overtake Harvey Barnes or Almiron or Anthony Gordon or Joe Linton if Joe Linton's not playing middle of the park, but playing as a left winger, which he will do on occasions. I think he's going to be chief support. But he's done well. He's got a terrific attitude, which is very, very important to Eddie, because he's big on that. And this guy's got that. And he's willing to work both ways, front and back. So he's a valued member of the squad. But unlike the other guys that we've talked about so far, like Maxi and Lascelles and Dubravka, Murphy's never been an established first teamer who suddenly dropped into the shadows. He's been in the shadows, nipped out the shadows, and is back in the shadows. But I can see why he's still at the club. But I don't think he's going to become a first team regular. But he's going to be regular squad player.
I think, as you say, he surprised a lot of people last season by how well he did when he came in the team. And I think what's very good to see is that, as you say, very good personality, very good attitude off the pitch. And Eddie Howe always used to say in press conferences, you would not believe the work that Jacob Murphy is doing on the training pitch. I've never seen someone work as hard. And I think that, coupled with the fact he's a boyhood Newcastle fan, it never really worked out for him at Newcastle. Very good to see him sort of getting amongst the goals and getting a good run in the team last season. As we say, we do expect him to be still with the club beyond the summer. A couple of players that we know are going to be with the first team beyond the summer because they've signed new deals is that of, as we've talked about, Mark Gillespie, the goalkeeper, Paul Dummett and Matt Ritchie. Now, a lot of this, I suspect, is going to, rest on the fact that Newcastle need a certain amount of homegrown players for the Champions League, and Gillespie and Dummett and all that sort of fit that mould. Is that how you see it? Are they just sort of making up the numbers this season, as harsh as it sounds?
It's very harsh to say that, but yes, they are. The final thing I think on Murphy, is that the great club sides, Aaron, aren't determined by 1 to 11, your first team, when everybody's fit, because everybody presumes, if you're 1 to 11's okay, you're great. No, but 12 to 22, that is often where great clubs become great or don't, because 12 to 22 is sometimes neglected because you think 1 to 11, and then there's no depth, and that's what Murphy provides, and that's what Lascelles will provide,
Mhm.
and that's what Dubravka will provide. But I mean, yes, we've talked about Ritchie, we've talked about Gillespie, we've talked about Dummett. Um, I think what you said, you hit the nail on the head. This homegrown thing and English players and all that sort of thing becomes very important. But also, the squad isn't even 22, is it? It's 25, for the Premier League. And those bottom pegs, if you like, have got to be filled. Now, there's a lot of players won't fill those bottom pegs because they're more ambitious than that, and that's understandable. But the people we are talking about here, I mean, Ritchie, now 33. Dummett, one club man, apart from being on loan, the wrong end of 30, and Gillespie, at his age, being where he is, they're willing to stay on for what is, in all their cases, one more year at the moment, isn't
Mhm.
it? And that surprised a lot of people, including me to a certain extent, that they were given that extra year's extension. It surprised me, but yet with hindsight, it doesn't, because you've got to fill those lower pegs and you've got to have homegrown. You can't have 25 players all brought in from the continent and meet all the criteria, financial fair play, and everything else. So you can see why they've been given that. And, Matt Ritchie has been a terrific servant to Newcastle United over a long, long period here. And of course, he's been even a longer servant to Eddie Howe, who he had him at Bournemouth. Dummett can fill left back in centre half and is a local lad. And Gillespie's the fourth choice keeper. So you can see why they've got an extra year. But I don't think in a year's time they'll be given an extra year again.
Mhm.
I think this is their nice hurrah to Newcastle United
Yeah.
is one more season.
And I think, as you say, it is a nice hurrah, isn't it? The fans that they're probably not going to play in the Champions League, but the fact that they're going to be in and around that environment after what they've given. I
You
mean,
know what'll happen, Aaron? You know what'll happen? Eddie will bring on Dummett in the 88th minute of a
yeah,
home leg in the Champions League for
yeah,
Newcastle, just
just
so
so
a
he gets
Geordie
his
lad can
minutes.
say he's played for Newcastle in the Champions League. Because
Very
he's
true.
thoughtful like that. I mean,
Yeah,
he is. Eddie Howe will bring Dummett on in 87 minutes at home to Sparta Prague, or making up, not necessarily,
yeah,
to Real Madrid, but and he'll bring him on, and he'll probably do the same with Ritchie. He won't with Gillespie because you don't with a keeper, but he'll probably do the same with Ritchie, so you can say you
yeah,
played in the Champions League.
absolutely. And I feel like I know we're talking about these players being complete backups and surplus to requirements, but also, as we spoke about with Lascelles and other players, mentality is so key to Eddie Howe, isn't it? And I think Matt Ritchie especially, as we said with Lascelles, such a big presence in that dressing room. Every time he comes on the pitch, you hear him shouting. Everybody always goes on about that moment at Brentford where he has his arm around Anthony Gordon and he's trying to calm him down. Matt Ritchie, more than the others, offers actually real leadership in that dressing room, doesn't he?
He does, and good for him. And if we remember, often, if you're a leader of men and you think that things aren't going well behind the scenes or there's sloppiness is coming in, you get agitated, didn't you? And remember, he got agitated with Steve Bruce. Remember, he snapped at him on the training ground because
Mhm.
I don't know, what we're getting 3 days off a week and we're getting a little bit sloppy and standards on what they were now. And he got quite sloppy. And good for him. And I think his attitude is first class, has been all his career. Um, I mean, what he's been with us now for what? I mean, great amount of seasons, Richie. And
Since the championship season, so yeah, seven,
yeah,
8 years
I
now.
mean, I at one time I felt, because I thought he's very aggressive and fronts up and does everything you want. But I always remember at one stage at Newcastle under the old regime when Ashley was there and managers, I suddenly found they were playing wing back, but essentially they were playing fullback. We had Murphy fullback on one side and Richie fullback on the others, and they were running more towards their own goal than they were towards the opposition goal, and they're essentially wingers. And
Yeah.
I mean, Matt Ritchie, bless him, about 3 times, one end where the winger is, he's trying to mark, and he's a winger himself, almost screwed himself into the ground, turning around that much, saying, where's he gone? And because they were having to do what didn't come naturally. So they've put in their time and earned the respect that they've got now. But well done, Matt, because he's been living away from a family that wanted him to move back down to Bournemouth and etc. etc. And he's spent all that time working up here, and he's doing it for one more season. Um, he's earned a lot of respect, and he's been a quality player. He really has. Paul Dummett's interesting because, again, my old mate Supermac Con, whose career was finished effectively by, he was 28 at Arsenal when he got a very bad knee injury. He retired at 29, but for a year he tried to recover from that injury. And was a big Dummett fan in the old days when Dummett was doing so. He thought he was the best defender in the club.
Mm-hmm.
In the Ashley days, in the Boost days, out and out defender. He always said he was a bit of a reminder of Frank Clark, who was our fullback when Supermac was playing and we made the cup final in '74, etc. And he always thought he was a good defender. But he can thoroughly believe why Newcastle want to keep him, because he's a good lad, he's reliable, he's good defensively, he's a left back and as a centre half, he's a local lad, etc., etc. But Supermac can never understand why Dummett doesn't want to go, because he says you can't get your career back, and he'll be sitting on the bench all next season. I mean, he played one game last season.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in a League Cup or something. He never played at all in the Premier League, at all. And so you're almost sacrificing your career for your pension, or for your love of the club. I think in Paul's case, for Geordie, for your love of the club. But as Supermax says, whose career was finished at 28, you can't get these years back. He'll retire, never having played. He'll play as much next season as he did last season. And for what? Wouldn't it be better to go and play? I'm happy for him to be here, but I can see where Supermac was coming from. And, if I'm Paul, you've got to accept your limitations at Newcastle now. For goodness sake, he's an orthodox left back, and he's not even the cover for Newcastle. The centre half is our left back, Dan Byrne, and then there's Target in as number 2, and then there's Dummett. And if you're looking at left-sided centre half, which is his other position, you've got Botman established, and you've got Byrne waiting there. So he's not going to get many chances to play. But we can see why, from the club's point of view, Richie and Dummett and Gillespie are here. From their point of view, it might be different. It's more understandable with Richie. Paul, but you see, he's never been anywhere else. He played on loan.
All he knows is Newcastle.
It is. And he loves him. And he loves them, so that you can rather understand, I guess. But I wonder, if he'll regret. I often wonder, Steve Harper was at Newcastle for about 21 years, and he played about 150 games for them in all that time, and he was touted at one stage to be in England, possible England international goalkeeper, but he sat behind Shea Given for so long, and I wonder deep inside him whether he thinks, if I had that career again, I'd go and play a few more games somewhere else, because I didn't play an awful lot. He would never admit that now, because his love of Newcastle kept him here in the same way as Paul Dummett. But I often think, you can say, hey, if we're opening that kind of worms, you can say Alan Shearer. Does he think that he was the greatest goal scorer we've ever had, but does he ever think if I'd gone to Manchester United, I would have had 3 Premier League titles, 5 cups, and whatever, and he never won anything?
I mean, you can say it about so many players, not just Newcastle. I mean, Harry Kane at the moment is, I know he's on course to maybe break the scoring record, but he could potentially finish his career having not won a single major trophy.
Yeah, at least Shearer won the Premier League with
Yeah,
Blackburn.
exactly. So
But
yeah, I mean, it is very very interesting, and on Dummett especially, as you say, he hasn't been anywhere else. It's all he really knows. He can't seem to stay fit. He probably knows that. Is he just thinking that, I could go elsewhere at a club that isn't in the Champions League and maybe play, but maybe also be on the sidelines? Do I just want to be on the sidelines where at least I know the club and I'm respected?
and as we said, Aaron, earlier on, both Richie and Dummett, I bet you they come on in the 86th minute of a
Yeah,
Champions League game this season,
and
and
it'll all be worth it.
and Eddie will have said that's made it worth you staying another year at
Exactly.
Newcastle because you've played
Yeah.
in the Champions League for Newcastle United. And I will guarantee you that they'll come. Mind, they mightn't have time to tie their bootlaces up before the final whistle goes, but I bet they come on.
Well, I hope so. I certainly hope we see them both in the group stage at St James's Park, as you say, against one of those lesser teams. John, we'll just finish with a very quick keep or sell for some of the players that we've mentioned, some of the players that we're not too sure about whether they're going to stay. So we'll discount the last sort of 3 or 4 that we spoke about. Maxi, we're pretty sure he's going to go, aren't we?
Yes, I think he is going to go because I think, despite what Eddie Howe says about wants to keep him, I think deep down Eddie Howe knows he's got to sacrifice him, else this Harvey Barnes deal might end up in the same way as the James Madison deal did, not completed, and the Kieran Tierney deal might not
Yeah.
completed. And it's a hard old world out there. For us to make certain we get Barnes, Maxi's probably got to go. And from Maxi's point of view, he'll think, I'm getting me wages doubled in Saudi. I I got the message last season that I'm going to be an impact sub off the bench and little more this coming season.
Mm-hmm.
And I am obviously not treasured quite as much because they're going out for Barnes anyway.
Yeah.
So yes, I think he'll go. He was left out of Rangers, he's left out of the tour. If that doesn't tell him, you'll be best to go with a big kiss from all of us, Maxi. Then and he's a bright guy, he'll get that message, and I think it'll suit both clubs. There'll be a bit of reluctance. Maxi will be a bit reluctant to leave us, and we'll be a bit reluctant to lose him. But the bottom line is, I think it'll happen.
Yeah, I think we're all of the agreement of that. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It is sad to see him go, but ultimately the club are moving on. Lascelles is a very interesting one, because again it's probably in his hands. Keep or sell. What are you thinking?
I think it's totally in his hands, as you said. If he pushed and wanted to go because he thought he could skip our side in the Championship or the lower half of the Premier League, then I'm certain Newcastle would say right. But I can see him staying, unless suddenly a club come in that flawed him and flawed Howe. A club come in late and said we'll take him, and in that case, if it appealed to both, they would let him go. But I keep him for the moment because what have we got? I mean, it's okay if we do go out and sign another centre half, but are we going to? And if we don't, we've got Botman, we've got Burnham, we've got Shaw, and what else have we got? So keep yourselves.
Yeah, very, very short at centre back if they don't go out and sign there. And just finally, Dubravka, another one who it's probably 50-50 as to whether he leaves this summer.
I think he'll stay. I think he'll stay as number 2 and Dollar will go. And I would accept that. You can't keep Darlow and Dubravka because you've already got Karius and Gillespie haven't signed new contracts. So one of them two, Darlow and Dubravka, has got to go. And Darlow's the one that's pushing, and Darlow's the one with a lot of suitors because he's that bit younger than Dubravka. And I think he'll go and Dubravka will stay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you say, quite a lot of Newcastle United fans would accept that if Dubravka stayed to be number 2. Well, John, thanks very much for joining us as ever on Let's Talk About. It's been a very, very good debate about some of those players that we might see leaving the club. Thank you to everyone who's listening on your podcast provider. Please remember to drop us a follow and a like. We'll have more podcasts coming in the next couple of days. We'll have a big YouTube video as well about Allan Saint-Maximin and his what looks like his exit to Saudi Arabia. Andrew Musgrove should be back next week from his paternity leave. I'm sure you're all very, very happy about. But until then, we'll speak to you very soon and have a very good weekend.
Cheers.